I am now an old guy, yet this happened to me when I was only 9 years old. It was 1914, the summer after my brother Dan died in the West Field, and 3 years before the United States entered World War. I have never told anyone about what happened at the fork in the creek that day, and I never will. At least not in my mouth. Chosen to write it down in this book, which I'll keep on the table next my bed. I can't write long because my hands tremble so much these days, and I have little to no strength, but I don't think it will last long. Someone may discover what I wrote later. That seems likely to me, given it is almost human nature to look at a book labeled diary after the owner has passed away. So, certainly, my words will probably be read. The better question is whether anyone will believe them. Almost definitely not, but that's not important. I am interested in freedom rather than conviction. Writing can provide that, I've discovered. For 20 years, I published a column called Long Ago and Far Away for the Castle Rock Call, and I know that sometimes what you write down disappears forever, like old photographs left in the blazing light, fading to nothing but white. I pray for that kind of liberation. A man in his 90s should be well past the terrors of childhood. But as my infirmities gradually creep up on me, like waves licking more and closer to some indifferently built fortress of sand, that terrible visage becomes clearer and clearer in my mind. It shines like a black star in the constellations of my childhood. What I might have done yesterday, and who I might have seen in my room at the nursing home coming home. Consider what I might have said to them, or they to me. Those things are gone, but the man in the black suit's face becomes clearer and closer, and I recall everything he says. I don't want to think about him, but I can't stop it, and sometimes at night, my old heart beats so hard and fast that I think it'll tear itself off of my chest. So I uncap my fountain pen and force my shaky old hand to write this worthless incident in the diary that one of my great-grandchildren, I can't remember her name for sure, at least not right now, but I know it starts with a East gave to me last Christmas and that I had never written in until now. Now I'll write in it. I will tell you how I met the man in the black suit on the bank of Castle Stream one afternoon in the summer of 1914. Motin was a different world back then, more so than I could possibly describe. That was a world without aeroplanes buzzing overhead, nearly no vehicles and trucks, and skies not divided into lanes and slices by overhead power wires. There was not a single paved road in the entire town, and the business district consisted of nothing but Corson's General Store, Thuts, livery, and hardware, the Methodist Church at Christ's Corner, the school, the town hall, and Harry's restaurant half a mile down the road, which my mother despised as the liquor house. The main change, however, was how people lived, how distant they were. I'm not sure people born after the middle of the 20th century could completely believe it, though they would claim they could to be courteous to elderly people like myself. For starters, phones did not exist in Western Maine at the time. The first one would not be installed for another 5 years, and by the time it arrived in our home, I was 19 years old and attending college at the University of Maine in Orono. But that's merely the ceiling of the thing. There was no doctor closer than Casco, and there were just a dozen houses in what could be considered town. There were no neighborhoods, and I'm not even sure we knew that, although we had a verb neighboring that described church activities and barn dances. Open fields were the exception rather than the rule. Out of town, the houses were farms that were far apart, and from December to the middle of March, we mostly hunkered down in the little pockets of stove warmth we called family. We hunkered down and listened to the wind in the chimney, hoping no one got sick, broke a leg, or had a stupid notion. Like the farmer in Castle Rock, who had hacked up his wife and children 3 winters before and then claimed in court that the spirits forced him to do so. Before the Great War, the majority of Moton was woods and bog. Long, gloomy regions full of moose, mosquitoes, snakes, and secrets. Ghosts were commonplace back then. This happened on Saturday. My father assigned me a long list of jobs to complete, some of which would have been Dan's if he was still living. He was my only sibling, and he died after being bitten by a bee. A year had passed, and my mother still refused to hear that. She said that no one had ever died as a result of a bee sting. When Mama Sweet, the oldest lady in the Methodist Ladies' Aid, attempted to tell her at the church supper the previous winter that the same thing had occurred to her favorite uncle back in '73, my mother clapped her hands over her ears, stood up, and walked out of the church basement. She hadn't returned since, and nothing my father said could change her mind. She said she was done with church, and that if she ever had to meet Helen Robichaud, Mama Sweet's true name, she would slap her eyes out. She would be unable to help herself, she said. That day, Dad assigned me to tote wood for the cook stove, weed the beans and cukes, pitch hay from the loft, gather 2 jugs of water for the cold pantry, and scrape as much old paint off the cellar bulkhead as possible. Then Dad told me I could go fishing if I didn't mind going alone. He needed to see Bill Eversham about some cows. I stated I didn't mind traveling alone, and my father grinned as if it didn't surprise him. He has given me a bamboo pole the week before, not because it was my birthday or anything, but because he liked to give me things on occasion, and I was excited to use it in Castle Stream, which was by far the troutiest stream I'd ever fished. But don't you go too far in the woods, I was instructed. Not beyond where it splits. No, sir, promise me. Yes, sir, I promise. Now promise, your mother. We were standing on the back stoop, and I was about to go to the spring house with the water jugs when my father stopped me. Now he turned me around to face my mother, who was standing at the marble counter in the bright morning sunlight streaming through the large windows over the sink. There was a curl of hair on the side of her forehead, caressing her brow dew. You see how clearly I recall everything. The brilliant light transformed that little curl into gold filaments, making me want to run up to her and wrap my arms around her. In that moment, I saw her as a woman, as my father would have seen her. I recall her wearing a house dress with small red roses on it and kneading bread. Candy, Bill, our little black Scotty dog, stood alertly beside her feet, looking up and ready for anything that could drop. My mother looked at me. I promise, I said. She smiled, but it was the troubled smile she had been giving ever since my father had carried Dan back from the West Field in his arms. My father had arrived, crying and bare-chested. He had removed his shirt and laid it over Dan's swollen face, which had turned color. My boy, he'd been crying. Ah, look at my boy. Jesus, look at my boy. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the only time I had heard my father use the Saviour's name in vain. What are you promising, Gary? She asked. Promise not to go no further than where it forks, ma'am, any further, any. She gave me a patient look and said nothing as her hands continued to manipulate the dough, which was now smooth and silky. I promise not to go any further than where it forks, ma'am. Thank you, Gary, she replied, and tried to memorize that gram. Yes, ma'am. Ma is for both the world and the school. Candy Bill followed me as I did my chores and sat between my feet as I bolted my lunch, looking up at me with the same attentiveness he had shown my mother while she was kneading her bread. But when I got my new bamboo pole and my old splintery creel and started out of the dooryard, he stopped and only stood in the dust by an old roll of snow fence, staring. I called him, but he didn't arrive. He yapped once or twice, as if to invite me back, but that was it. "Stay then," I answered, pretending I didn't care. I did, at least a bit. Candy, Bill, and I often went fishing together. My mother approached the door and stared out at me, her left hand put up to hide her eyes. I can still picture her in that way. It's like gazing at a snapshot of someone who later grew unhappy or died unexpectedly. "Gary, take care of your father now." "Yes, ma'am, I will." She waved. I also waved. Then I went away without looking at her. For the first quarter mile or so, the sun beat down on my neck, hard and scorching, but then I entered the woods, where a double shade fell over the road. It was chilly and first-scented, and you could hear the wind hissing through the deep-needled woods. I strolled with my pole on my shoulder, as lads did back then, and my creel in the other hand, like a valise or a salesman's sample case, about 2 miles into the woods, along a road that was really nothing more than a double rut with a grassy strip climbing up the center hump. I started hearing the hurried, eager gossip of Castle Stream. My heart rate increased as I imagined trout with colorful speckled backs and pure white bellies. The stream passed under a little wooden bridge, and the banks, the trail down to the water, was steep and brushy. I cautiously made my way down, gripping on where I could and pushing my heels in. I felt like I was back in mid-spring after leaving summer behind. The chill rose gently off the water, and there was a moss-like green scent. When I came to the edge of the water, I stayed there for a short time, inhaling deeply of the mossy smell and watching the dragonflies circle and the skitterbugs skate. Then, further down, I seen a trout leap at a butterflyer, decent big brookie, perhaps 14 inches long, and remembered I hadn't come here just to look. I strolled along the bank, following the river, and wet my line for the first time, with the bridge still visible upstream. Something tugged the tip of my pole down a few times and ate half of my worm, but he was too cunning for my 9-year-old hands, or perhaps just not hungry enough to be careless so. I continued. I stopped at 2 or 3 other places before reaching the point where Castle Stream forks, going southwest into Castle Rock and southeast into Kashwakarmak Township. And at one of them I caught the largest trout I've ever caught in my life, measuring 19 inches from tip to tail on the little ruler I kept in my creel. Even back then, that was a giant brook trout. If I had accepted this as a gift for one day and returned, I would not be writing now, and I can already tell this is going to take longer than I anticipated. But I didn't. Instead, I took care of my catch right away, as my father had instructed me, washing it, depositing it on dry grass at the bottom of the creel, and then laying damp grass on top of it, and moved on. At the age of 9, I didn't think capturing a 19-inch brook trout was particularly spectacular, though I did remember being shocked that my line hadn't snapped. When I dragged it out and swung it towards me in a clumsy tail-flapping arc, netless and artlessly, after 10 minutes, I arrived at the split point of Castle Stream, which is now surrounded by a district grammar school and a settlement of double-wide homes. The stream divides around a large grey rock that is nearly the size of our outhouse. There was a nice flat area here, grassy and soft, overlooking what my father and I dubbed South Branch. I squatted on my heels, slipped my line into the water, and almost quickly landed a nice rainbow trout. He wasn't as big as my brookie, just about a foot, but he was still a good fish. I cleaned the gills, stowed them in my creel, and returned my line to the water. This time, there was no quick bite, so I leaned back and looked up at the blue stripe of sky visible down the stream's path. Clouds glided by from west to east, and I attempted to imagine what they looked like. I saw a unicorn, then a rooster, and then a dog that looked similar to Candy Bill. I fell asleep while hunting for the net one. Or perhaps slept. I do not know for sure. All I know is that a powerful tug on my line nearly yanked the bamboo pole from off my grasp was what drew me back into the afternoon. I sat up, gripped the pole, and realized that something was perched on the tip of my nose. I crossed my eyes and noticed a bee. My heart seemed to stop beating, and for a brief moment, I thought I was about to wet my pants. The tug on my line returned, harder this time, but despite maintaining my grip on the pole's end to prevent it from being pushed into the stream and maybe carried away, I believe I even had the presence of mind to snub the line with my fingertip. I made no move to reel in my capture. My startled concentration was focused on the fat, black Candilo creature, utilizing my nose as a rest stop. I slowly protruded my lower lip and blew upward. The bee ruffled slightly but maintained its position. I blew once more, and it ruffled again. But this time, it seemed to shift impatiently, and I didn't dare blow any longer, for fear of losing its displeasure and shooting me. It was too close for me to see what it was doing, but I could easily image it shoving its stinger into one of my nostrils and shooting poison up into my eyes and my brain. An awful thought occurred to me, that this was the bee that had killed my brother. I knew it wasn't true, and not just because honeybees typically live for a year or less, with the exception of queens, whose lifespan is unknown. It couldn't be true because bees died when stung, which I understood even at the age of 9. Their stingers were barbed, and when they attempted to fly away after the deed, they tore themselves apart. Nonetheless, the notion persisted. This was a particular bee, a devil bee, and it had returned to kill the other of Albion and Loretta's 2 sons. And here's something else. I'd been stung by bees before, and while the stings had swollen more than usual, I'm not sure I'd never died as a result. That was exclusively for my brother, a dreadful trap that had been set for him from the start, one that I had managed to avoid. Attempting to focus on the bee, I crossed my eyes until they stung. However, rationality failed. My brother was killed by a bee, which caused my father to remove his shirt and conceal Dan's swollen face. Even in the depths of his anguish, he had done so because he did not want his wife to know what had happened to her firstborn. Now the bee had back, and it was going to kill me. It would kill me, and I would die in convulsions on the bank, flopping like a brookie, when you removed the hook from its mouth. As I sat there, shivering on the verge of terror, ready to run to my feet, and then, wherever, I heard a report from behind. It was as piercing and peremptory as a pistol discharge, but I recognized it as someone clapping his hands. A single clap. The bee slid from my nose and into my lap, just as it arrived. It laid on my trousers, its legs jutting up, and its stinger, a threatless black thread against the old scuffed brown corduroy. I realized it was as dead as a doornail right away. At the same time, the pole exerted another tug, the strongest yet, and I nearly lost it again. I grabbed it with both hands and yanked it hard enough to have my father grasp his head with both hands. If he had been around, a rainbow trout, a bit larger than the one I'd just caught, erupted out of the water in a wet, writhing flash. It sprayed small drips of water from its tail filament, resembling the romanticized fishing images seen on the covers of men's magazines such as Rue and Man's Adventure in the 1950s. At the time, bringing in a huge one was the last thing on my mind. So when the line snapped and the fish slid back into the stream, I scarcely noticed. I glanced over my shoulder to see who had applauded. A figure stood above me at the edge of the trees. His face was extremely lengthy and pallid. His black hair was combed tightly against his skull and meticulously parted on the left side of his tiny head. He was extremely tall. He was dressed in a black three-piece suit, and I could tell he wasn't human because his eyes were the orangey red of wood stove flames. I don't simply mean the irises. He has no irises, pupils, or whites. His eyes were entirely orange, shifting and flickering. Is it really too late to convey exactly what I mean? He was on fire within, and his eyes resembled the small isinglass portholes seen in stove doors. My bladder let go, and the scuffed brown the dead bee was laying on turned a deeper brown. I was barely conscious of what had occurred, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from the man standing on top of the bank, looking down at me. The man who had strolled out of 30 miles of trackless western Maine woods in a fine black suit and slim glistening leather shoes. I could see the watch chain wrapped across his vest gleaming in the July sun. There was not a single pine needle on him. And he smiled at me. "Why, it's a fisher boy," he cried in a soft, appealing voice. Imagine that. Are we well greeted, fisher boy? "Hello, sir," I answered. The voice that came from me did not shake, but it did not sound like mine. It sounded old, perhaps like Dan's voice, or my father's even, and all I could think about was how he might let me go, if I pretended not to see what he was. If I pretended I didn't notice that flames were burning and dancing where his eyes should have been. "I've saved you a nasty sting, perhaps," he remarked, and then, to my surprise, he came down the bank to where I sat with a dead bee. I have a wet lap and a bamboo fishing pole in my nerveless hands. His slick-soled city shoes should have slipped on the low, grassy weeds that dressed the steep bank. But they didn't, and they didn't leave any footprints, as far as I could tell. There were no broken twigs, crushed leaves, or trampled shoe shapes where his feet had touched or appeared to touch. Even before he arrived, I detected a fragrance emanating from the skin beneath the suit, the smell of burned matches, the odor of sulfur. The man in the dark outfit was the devil. He had stepped out of the dense woods between Motton and Kashwakarmak and was now standing behind me, with a hand as pale as that of a store window dummy. The fingers were extremely lengthy. He crouched beside me on his hams, his knees bouncing much like any other man's, but as he shifted his hands, so they dangled between his knees. I noticed that each of those long fingers terminated in a long yellow claw rather than a fingernail. "You didn't answer my question, fisher boy," he continued, his voice soft. It reminded me of the voice of one of those radio announcers on big band performances years later, who would peddle Geritol, Saraton, Ovaltine, and Dr. Grabo pipes. "Are we well acquainted? Please don't hurt me," I said softly, hardly audible. I was more terrified than I could ever express, more afraid than I want to remember. But I do. I never considered the possibility that I was having a dream, but I suppose I would have if I had been older. But I was only 9 years old, and I understood the truth when it squatted alongside me. My father would have claimed I knew the difference between a hawk and a hans. The man who emerged from the woods on that Saturday afternoon in July was the devil, and his brains were burning inside the empty holes in his eyes. "Oh, am I smelling something?" he inquired, as if he had not heard me. ... Even though I knew he had. "Do I smell anything? ... Wet." He leaned forward towards me, his nose sticking out, like someone who intends to sniff a flower, and I noticed something terrible. As the shadow of his head moved across the bank, the grass beneath it turned yellow and perished. He bent his head to my trousers and smelt. His glaring eyes were half closed, as if he had absorbed some sublime aroma and wanted to focus solely on that. "That's bad," he cried. "Lovely bad." And then he chanted, opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I can smell Gary's lemonade. Then he threw himself on his back in the small flat and laughed uncontrollably. It sounded like a crazy I considered running, but my legs appeared to be 2 counties distant from my mind. I wasn't crying, even though I had soiled my pants like a baby. I was too afraid to cry. I instantly realized that I was going to die, most likely painfully, but the worst part was that this might not be the worst of it. The worst might happen later, after I had died. He sat up abruptly, the scent of burning matches wafting from his suit and making me feel all gaggy in my throat. He gazed at me sternly with his small white face and flaming eyes, yet there was also a sense of humor about him. There was always a sense of laughter about him. Then I thought of how she'd looked when I set off with my fishing pole, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hand shielding her eyes. She looked like a snapshot of someone you expected to see again but never did. "No, you lied," I yelled. He smiled the sadly patient look of someone who has frequently been unfairly accused. "I'm afraid not," he replied. "The same thing occurred to your brother, Gary. It was a bee." "Sad news, Fisher boy," he said. "I've come with sad news." I could only look at him, his black suit, fine black shoes, and long white fingers that ended in talons rather than nails. "Your mother is dead." "No," I cried. I remembered her preparing bread, the curl laying across her forehead and barely brushing her brow, standing there in the bright morning sunlight, and the horror returned. ... But not for me this time. "No, that's not true," I replied, and I began to cry. "She's old, she's 35. If a bee bite could kill her the way it did Danny, she'd be dead a long time ago, and you're a lying bastard." I had referred to the devil as a lying bastard. On some level, I was aware of this, but the immensity of what he'd spoken consumed the entirety of my thoughts. Is my mother dead? He could as well have told me there was a new ocean where the Rockies had been. But I did believe him. On some level, I absolutely believed him, just as we all believe the worst thing our hearts can conjure. "I understand your grief, little fisher boy, but that particular argument just doesn't hold water, I'm afraid." He spoke in a dreadful, frustrating tone of phony consolation, devoid of regret or sympathy. A man can go his whole life without seeing a mockingbird. Does that mean mockingbirds don't exist? Your mother? A fish jumped beneath us. The man in the black suit frowned and pointed his finger at it. The trout convulsed in the air, its body bending so violently that for a short second it appeared to be snapping at its own tail. And when it fell back into Castle Stream, it floated lifelessly, dead. It collided with the large grey rock where the waves separated, whirled around twice in the whirlpool eddy that created there, and then floated away in the direction of Castle Rock. Meanwhile, the dreadful stranger returned his blazing eyes to me, his thin lips drawn back from tiny rows of razor teeth in a cannibal smile. "Your mother simply went through her entire life without being stung by a bee," he told me. "But then, less than an hour ago, actually, one flew in through the kitchen window while she was taking the bread out of the oven and putting it on the counter to cool." No, I'm not going to hear this. I raised my hands and clamped them round my ears. He pursed his lips as if to whistle and blew gently at me. It was just a few breaths, but the odor was unbearable. Clogged sewers, outhouses that had never seen a sprinkle of lime, and dead chickens after a flood. My hands slipped from the sides of my face. "Good," he said. "Gary, you need to hear this. This is my little fisher boy. It was your mother who passed that fatal weakness onto your brother Dan. You got some of I, but you also got a protection from your father that poor Dan somehow missed." He pursed his lips again, this time making a cruelly comic little tisk-tisk sound instead of blowing his nasty breath at me. So, although I don't like to speak ill of the dead, it's almost a case of poetic justice, isn't it? After all, she killed your brother Dan as if she had held a revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. No, I muttered. No, it isn't true. I assure you it is, he replied. A bee flew into the window and landed on her neck. She slapped at it before she even realized what she was doing. You were smarter than that, Gary. The bee stung her. She felt her throat begin to close up at once. This is what happens to those who are allergic to bee venom. Their throats tighten and they drown in the open air. That explains why Dan's face was bloated and purple. That is why your father covered it with his shirt. I stared at him, suddenly unable to speak. Tears ran down my cheeks. I didn't want to believe him, and I knew from church that the devil is the father of lies, but I do. I suppose he was standing in our front yard, looking in the kitchen window, as my mother collapsed to her knees, clutching her swollen throat, and Candy Bill danced around her, barking shrilly. She made the most wonderfully awful noises. The man in the black suit reflected, and she scratched her face quite badly, I'm afraid. Her eyes bulged out like frogs. She wept. He paused, then added, "Isn't it wonderful that she grieved as she died? Here's the most lovely thing of all. After she had died, ... do you know what Candy Bill did after she had been lying on the floor for about 15 minutes with nothing except the sound of the stove ticking and that little stick of a bee stinger jutting out of the side of her neck so small? That tiny scoundrel licked her tears, first on one side, ... and then on the other. He glanced out at the stream for a moment, his expression melancholy, thoughtful. Then he turned back to me, and his expression of bereavement faded like a dream. His face was as limp and eager as that of a corpse that had died hungry. His eyes burned. I could see his sharp little teeth through his pale lips. "I'm starving," he stated abruptly. "I am going to kill you, tear you open, and consume your intestines. Little fisherman, what are your thoughts about that?" No, I tried saying, "Please, no," but nothing came out. He intended to do it, I noticed. He truly intended to do it. "I'm just so hungry," he said, both petulant and playful. "Take my word for it. You will not want to live without your precious mama, because your father is the type of man who will need a warm hole to stick it in, and if you are the only one available, you will have to serve. I'll spare you all the discomfort and unpleasantness. Remember, you'll go to heaven. Murdered souls always make it to heaven. So, Gary, we will both be serving God this afternoon. Isn't it nice?" He reached for me again with his long, pale hands, and without thinking about it, I flipped open the top of my creel, poured all the way down to the bottom, and pulled out the monster brookie I'd caught earlier, the one I should have been pleased with. I held it out to him blindly, my fingers in the red slit of its belly from which I had extracted its insides after the man in the black suit threatened to take mine. The fish's glazed eye looked dreamily at me, and the gold ring around the black center reminded me of my mother's wedding band. And when I saw her laying in her casket with the sun gleaming off the wedding band, I knew it was true. She had been stung by a bee, drowned in the warm bread-smelling kitchen air, and Candy Bill had licked her dying tears off her swollen cheeks. "Big fish." The man in the black suit shouted out in a guttural, eager tone. "Oh, big fish." He grabbed it from me and shoved it into a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth ever could. Many years later, when I was 75, I knew it was 75 because, summer I resigned from teaching. I went to the New England Aquarium and saw a shark. The man in the black suit's mouth was like that shark's mouth when it opened, Only his gullet was blazing red, the same color as his awful eyes. And I felt heat bake out of it and into my face, similar to how you feel a sudden wave of heat come pushing out of a fireplace when a dry piece of wood catches fire. And I didn't envision that heat, either. I know I didn't, because just as he put the head of my 19-inch brook trout between his gaping jaws, I seen the scales along the sides of the fish rise up and curl like bits of paper floating over an open incinerator. He slid the fish in, like a wandering showman swallowing a sword. He didn't chew, and his bright eyes bulged out, as if in effort. The fish moved in and out, his throat bulging as it slipped down his gullet, and he began to scream his own tears. Except for his tears, which were red and heavy. I believe it was the sight of their bleeding tears that restored my body. I'm not sure why that should have been, but I believe it was. I leaped to my feet like a jack sprung from its bow, turned with my bamboo pole in one hand, and fled up the bank, leaning over and tearing tough bunches of weeds out with my free hand in an effort to get up the slope faster. He made a choked, violent noise like any man with his lips to full end. I looked back just as I reached the top. He was following me, the back of his suit coat billowing and his thin gold watch chain flashing and winking in the sunlight. The fish's tail was still protruding from his mouth, and I could smell the remainder roasting in the oven of his neck. He lunged for me, probing with his talons, and I fled up the bank. After about 100 yards, I found my voice and began screaming, not just in fear, but also in grief for my lovely deceased mother. He followed me. I heard snapping branches and whipping bushes, but I didn't glance back. I bent my head, slit my eyes against the shrubs and low-hanging branches along the stream's edge, and dashed as fast as I could. And at each phase, I expected to feel his hands dropping on my shoulders, drawing me back into a final heated hug. That did not happen. Some unknown amount of time later, it couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 minutes, but it felt like forever. I spotted the bridge through layers of leaves and furs, still screaming, but breathlessly now, like a tea kettle almost cooked dry. I charged up to the second, steeper bank. Halfway to the top, I dropped to my knees, looked over my shoulder, and saw the man in the black suit practically at my heels, his white face contorted with wrath and greed. His cheeks were splashed with bloody tears, and his shark's mouth was open like a hinge. Fisher boy. He snarled and rushed up the bank behind me, seizing my foot with one long hand. I broke away, turned, and flung my fishing rod at him. He quickly swatted it down, but it tangled his feet, forcing him to his knees. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and bolted to the top of the slope. I almost slipped at the very top, but I was able to grab one of the support struts running beneath the bridge and preserve myself. "You can't run away, Fisher boy," he cried from behind me. He sounded angry, but also like he was smiling. "It takes more than one mouthful of trout to fill me up. Leave me alone." I screamed back at him. I seized the bridge's railing and launched myself over it in a clumsy somersault, leaving splinters on my hands and hitting my head so hard on the boards that I saw stars as I came down. I rolled over onto my tummy and started crawling. I lurched to my feet just before reaching the end of the bridge, staggered once, recovered my rhythm, and started running. I ran as fast as a 9-year-old boy can. It felt like my feet only hit the ground every 3rd or 4th step, which could be accurate. I sprinted straight up the road's right-hand wheel rat, until my temples pounded and my eyes pulsed in their sockets, until I felt a hot stitch from the bottom of my ribcage to my armpit, until I could taste blood and metal shavings in the back of my throat. When I couldn't run any longer, so I stumbled to a halt and looked back over my shoulder, puffing and blowing like a wind-broke horse. I was certain I'd see him standing directly behind me in his natty black suit. The watch chain a dazzling loop across his waistcoat, and not a single hair out of place. But he was gone. The road leading back towards Castle Stream, amid the darkly massed pines and spruces, was vacant. But I sensed him nearby in the woods, observing me with his grass-fire eyes and smelt of burnt matches and roasted fish. I turned and began walking as fast as I could, limping slightly. I'd pulled muscles in both legs, and when I got out of bed the next morning, I was so sore that I could not walk. However, I didn't notice such things at the time. I just kept checking over my shoulder to make sure the road behind me was still vacant. It was, every time I glanced, yet those backward looks seemed to exacerbate rather than alleviate my worry. The firs were darker and massier, and I couldn't stop thinking about what was behind the trees that lined the road-long twisted corridors of forest. Leg-breaking deadfalls, ravines where anything could live. Until that Saturday in 1914, I had assumed that bears were the worst thing the forest could provide. Now I knew better. A mile or so further up the road, just beyond the point where it emerged from the woods and joined the Gigan Flat Road, I noticed my father approaching me and whistling the old oaken bucket. He was holding his own rod, the one with the fancy spinning reel from Monkey Ward. In his other hand, he held his creel, which had a ribbon weaved across the handle by my mother, when Dan was still living. The ribbon read, "I had been strolling, but when I spotted him, I started running again, screaming dab, 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 at the top of my lungs, stumbling from side to side on my exhausted, stiff legs like a drunken sailor." The expression of surprise on his face when he recognized me may have been humorous in other circumstances, but not in these. He tossed his rod and creel on the road without even looking down at them and raced to me. It was the fastest I'd ever seen my father run. When we collided, it's a surprise we didn't both pass out. And I hit my face on his belt buckle hard enough to cause a nosebleed. I didn't realize it until later. I just reached out my arms and hugged him as hard as I could. I hung on and pressed my burning face on his belly, splattering blood, tears, and snot all over his old blue work shirt. "Gary, what is it? What happened? Are you okay? Ma is dead," I sobbed. I encountered a man in the woods, and he told me. "Ma is dead. She was stung by a bee and swelled up, just like Dan, and she died. She's on the kitchen floor with Candy Bill, ... licked the tears. Get off her, ... get off her." Face was the final word I had to utter, but my chest was so tight I couldn't get it out. My tears were streaming again, and my father's shocked, terrified expression had blurred into 3 overlapping images. I started howling, not like a young kid who has skunked his knee, but like a dog that has seen something awful in the moonlight hand. My father shoved my head into his hard, flat stomach again. I squirmed out from beneath his grip and looked back over my shoulder. I wanted to make sure the man in the black suit was not coming. There was no sign of him, and the road leading back into the woods was utterly deserted. I vowed myself that I would never walk back down that road again, no matter what. And I suppose God's greatest blessing to his animals below is that they cannot see the future. It could have torn my heart if I had realized I'd be returning down that road not 2 hours later. However, at the time, I was merely relieved to find that we were still alone. Then I remembered my mother, my beautiful dead mother, and cried again, this time against my father's stomach. "Gary, listen to me," he urged a few moments later. I continued to cry, and he gave me a little more time before reaching down and lifting my chin, allowing him to see my face and me to see his. "Your mom's fine," he said. I could only look at him as tears streamed down my cheeks. I did not believe him. I don't know who told you different, or what kind of dirty dog would want to put a scare like that into a little boy, but I swear to God, your mother's fine. But, but, he said, double quotes. I do not care what he said. I returned from Eversham's earlier than expected. He doesn't want to sell any cows. It's all talk and felt. I had time to meet up with you. I grabbed my pole and creel, and your mother cooked us some jelly foldovers. Her newest bread, still warm. So she was okay half an hour ago, Gary, and I guarantee you that no one has heard anything different from this direction. Not in half an hour. He peeked over my shoulder. Who was the man, and where was he? I'm going to find him and beat him to a pulp. I had 1,000 thoughts in 2 seconds or so it seemed, but the last one was the most powerful. If my father met the man in the black suit, I didn't think he would be the one to thrash him, or simply walking away. I kept thinking about those long white fingers and the talons at the ends of them. Gary, I don't know that I remember, I stated. Were you where the stream split? What about the large rock? I could never lie to my father when he asked a direct question, not to save his or my life. Yes, but don't go down there. I grabbed his arm with both hands and tugged firmly. Please don't. He was a frightening man. Inspiration struck like a bright lightning bolt. I think he had a gun. He stared at me thoughtfully. Maybe there wasn't a man, he added, raising his voice slightly on the final word and transforming it into something that was almost but not quite a question. Perhaps you fell asleep while fishing and had a nasty dream, son. Like those you had about Danny last winter. I had a lot of awful dreams about Dan last winter. Dreams in which I would open the door to our closet or to the dark, fruity inside. Rear of the cider shed and find him standing there, staring at me through his purple, strangulated face. Many of these visions had woken me up screaming, as had my parents. I had also fallen asleep on the bank of the stream for a short time, dozed off. In any case, but I hadn't dreamed, and I was certain I had awoke just before the man in the black suit smacked the bee dead, sending it crashing off my nose and into my lap. I wasn't sure I had imagined him in the same way I had dreamed Dan, but my encounter with him had already taken on a dreamlike character in my mind, as I assume supernatural things always do. But if my dad felt that the man had simply been in my thoughts, that could be better. Better for him, it might have been, I guess, I replied. Well, we ought to go back and find your rod and your creel. He did start in that direction, and I had to frantically grab on his arm to stop him and turn him back towards me. Later, I said, Please, Dad, I want to see Mother. I need to see her with my own eyes. He thought about it and nodded. Yes, I suppose so. We'll go home first, then retrieve your rod and creel later. So we strolled back to the farm together, my father holding his fishing pole on his shoulder like one of my buddies, me carrying his creel, and both of us eating folded over slices of my mother's bread covered with blackcurrant jam. Have you caught anything? He asked as we approached the barn. Yes, sir, I replied. The rainbow, pretty good-sized. Ambi was a much bigger brookie, I assumed, but did not mention. To be honest, it was the biggest one I'd ever seen, but I don't have it to show you. Dab, I gave that one to the man in the black suit, so he wouldn't eat me. Ambi, it worked. ... only just, barely. Is that all? Nothing else? After I caught it, I fell asleep. This was neither an answer nor a falsehood. Fortunately, you did not lose your pole, didn't you, Gary? No, sir, I replied grudgingly. Lying about that would do nothing. Even if I could come up with a whopper, it wouldn't matter if he was determined to return for my creel, which I could tell by his expression. Candy Bill rushed out of the back door, barking loudly and wagging his tail, like Scotties do when excited. I couldn't wait any longer. Hope and anxiety rose in my throat like foam. I broke away from my father and dashed to the house, still carrying his creel and convinced, in my heart of hearts, that I would find my mother dead on the kitchen floor, her face swollen and purple like Dan's had been when my father carried him in from the west field, crying and calling the name of Jesus, but she was still standing at the counter, singing a melody while shelling peas into a bowl. She looked round at me, first surprised and then terrified as she noticed my big eyes and pale cheeks. "Gary, what is it? What is the matter?" I didn't say anything. Instead, I raced to her and kissed her. At some point, my father stepped in and said, "Don't worry. Lo, he's well. He simply had one of his horrible dreams down there by the creek." "Pray God, it's the last one," she whispered, hugging me harder. Candy Bill danced about our feet, barking his piercing bark. "You don't have to come with me if you don't want to, Gary," my father added, despite the fact that he had already stated that he believed I should, that I should return, that I should face my fear, as I imagine people would say nowadays. That's okay for imaginary fears, but 2 hours hadn't changed my mind about the man in the black suit being real. However, I doubt I could persuade my father of this. I don't think there was ever a 9-year-old who could convince his father that he had seen the devil step out of the woods in a black outfit. "I'll come," I replied. I had walked out of the house to meet him before he went, mustering all my courage to get my feet going, and we were now standing at the chopping block in the side yard near the woodpile. "What do you have behind your back?" he asked. I brought it out carefully. I would accompany him, hoping that the man in the black suit with the arrow-straight part along the left side of his head was no longer present. But if he wasn't, I wanted to be ready, as prepared as I could be. I had the family Bible in my hand, which I had pulled out from behind me. I brought my New Testament, which I won for memorizing the most psalms in the Thursday night youth fellowship competition. I managed 8, though most of them, except the 23rd, had floated out of my mind in a week's time. But the little red testament didn't seem like enough when you were possibly going to face the devil himself. Not even when the words of Jesus were marked out in red ink. My father looked at the old Bible, which was filled with family records and pictures, and I expected him to instruct me to put it back, but he didn't. He nodded, expressing mixed regret and sympathy. "All right," he said. "Is your mother aware you stole that?" "No, sir." He nodded again. "Then we'll hope she doesn't notice it's gone before we come back. Come on, and do not drop it." Half an hour later, the two of us stood on the bank, staring down at the fork in Castle Stream and the flat area where I had met the man with the red-orange eyes. I was holding my bamboo rod, which I had picked up below the bridge, and my creel was lying flat on the ground below. The wicker top was flipped back. My father and I stood looking down for a long time, neither of us saying anything. Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I smell Gary's lemonade. That was his horrible little poem, and after reciting it, he threw himself on his back, giggling like a toddler who has just discovered that he has the bravery to pronounce bathroom terms like crap or piss. The flat area down there was as green and lush as any site in Maine that receives sunlight in early July. ... except where a stranger had lied. There, the grass was dead and yellow, shaped like a man. I looked down and noticed that I was holding our lumpy old family Bible in front of me, both thumbs pressing so firmly on the cover that they became white. It was the way Mama Sweet's husband, Norval, handled a willow fork while attempting to douse a well. "Stay here," my father yelled finally, skidding sideways down the bank, pressing his shoes into the lush, soft dirt and holding his arms out for balance. I stood there, holding the Bible stiffly at the ends of my arms, like a willow fork, my pulse pounding furiously. I'm not sure if I felt watched at the moment, but I was too afraid to feel anything other than a want to leave that spot and those woods. My father bent down, sniffed where the grass had died, and grimaced. I recognized what he smelt: burning matches. Then he snatched my creel and hurried back up the bank. He took a quick glance over his shoulder to ensure that nothing was coming up behind him. Nothing was. When he handed me the creel, the lid was still hanging back on the clever small leather hinges. I looked inside and found nothing but 2 handfuls of grass. "Thought you said you caught a rainbow," remarked my dad, "but maybe you dreamed that, too." Something in his voice irritated me. "No, sir," I replied. "I caught one. Well, it certainly didn't flop out, even if it was gutted and cleaned. You wouldn't put a catch in your fisher bow without. Would you do that, Gary? I trained you better than that." "Yes, sir, ... So if you didn't dream catching it, and if it was dead in the bow, something must have come along and eaten it," my father replied, and then grabbed another quick peek over his shoulder, eyes startled, as if he had seen something move in the woods. I wasn't surprised to see drops of sweat standing out on his forehead like large transparent gems. "Come on," he replied. "Let's get the hell out of here." I agreed to that, and we returned along the bank to the bridge, walking quickly without speaking. When we arrived, my father dropped to one knee and examined the location where we discovered my rod. There was another patch of dead grass, and the lady's slipper was brown and coiled in on itself, as if it had been burnt by a blast of hot air. While my father did this, I gazed through my empty creel. He must have gone back and eaten my other fish, too, I informed him. My father looked up at me and said, "Other fish?" "Yes, sir, I didn't tell you, but I also caught a brookie, a large one. He was very hungry, that fella." I wanted to say more, but the words shook just behind my lips, so I didn't. We climbed up to the bridge and helped each other over the railing. My father took my creel, glanced into it, and then flung it over the rail. I arrived just in time to watch it splash down and float away like a boat, sinking further into the stream as the water rushed in between the wicker weavings. "It smelt bad," my father remarked, but he didn't look at me, and his tone was curiously defensive. It was the only time I'd ever heard him speak like that. "Yes, sir. We will inform your mother that we couldn't find it, if she asks. If she doesn't ask, we won't tell her." "No, sir, we won't." And she didn't, and neither did we, so that was how it was. That day in the woods was 81 years ago, and for many of those years I never thought about it. Not awake, at least. I can't tell for certain what my dreams are, just like any other man or woman in history. But now that I'm older, I seem to be dreaming awake. My infirmities have crept up like waves that will soon take a child's abandoned sandcastle, and my memories have also crept up, making me think of some old rhyme that went, in part, "Just leave them alone and they'll come home, wagging their tails behind them." I remember meals I ate, games I played, girls I kissed in the school cloakroom when we played post office, boys I chummed with, the first drink I ever took. The first cigarette I ever smoked went behind Dickie Hammer's pig shed, and I vomited. Yet, of all the memories, the one of the man in the black suit is the most powerful, and it shines with its own ethereal, haunted light. He existed. He was the devil, and that day I was either his errand or his luck. I'm increasingly certain that avoiding him was pure luck, rather than the intercession of the God I've adored and sung hymns to my entire life. As I lie here in my nursing home room and in the wrecked sandcastle that is my body, I tell myself that I don't need to fear the devil, since I've led a nice, kindly life. Sometimes I remind myself that it was I, not my father, who eventually coaxed my mother back to church later that summer. In the dark, however, these thoughts have little ability to soothe or console. In the darkness, a voice murmurs that the 9-year-old boy I was had done nothing to warrant true fear of the devil. Nonetheless, the devil appeared, and in the dark, I occasionally hear that voice dip even lower into uncanny realms. Big fish, it whispers in quiet greed, and all the moral principles crumble before its thirst. Big fish, the devil visited me once, a long time ago. What if he returns now? I'm too elderly to sprint, and from the bathroom without my walker. I have no excellent, large brook fish to offer him, even for a moment or two. I am elderly, and my creel is empty. What if he came back and found me like this? And suppose he's still hungry?